Thank you.
I made it worse. I don't know.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends if you're going to be
Over here.
to this. Yeah, off the slide. I mean, I can follow you. Don't worry about it.
All right.
Well, it's after 3, right?
Let's roll.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Jim Kaufman. I'm a Forest Projects Coordinator with the Alliance of Chesapeake Bay out of Pennsylvania. And I have the privilege to be the moderator today. So I'm going to try to moderate the heck out of this session. I have the privilege to introduce Sarah Xenophon of Team Ag. Sarah works out of Lancaster in Pennsylvania with me. We work very closely, our organizations. She's a wealth of knowledge. Glad to have her here today. Really looking forward to learning from you. Her presentation is entitled Project Management for Enduring Success. So looking forward to it. I'll let you introduce yourself if that's okay, but
Yeah.
Really looking forward to it. And
Thanks,
I'm
Jim.
gonna sit down and be quiet now. Thanks, Sarah.
Very good. Excellent. Well, that's not working. Is there a different clicker?
No, just a second. Oh, let me see.
Which over here? Beautiful. All right. So who am I? That's pretty existential. Who are we really? So I have humble beginnings. Grew up exploring creeks, learning through Envirothon. If any of you know that program, it's awesome. Great way to engage kids. Obviously, it hooked me, and look at us now. After that, I went to Penn State, got my, I majored in environmental resource management, so lots of environmental science, wetlands, soils, trees, all the good stuff. Shortly thereafter, I started working for Penn State for the Ag and Environment Center, where I did a lot of outreach and engagement with agricultural producers, so lots of farmers and other landowners. We did some stormwater practices as well. But as I started to get into the workforce, I realized knowing lots and lots about wetlands and soils and trees doesn't necessarily help me make sure that these projects move smoothly. And the more and more I was managing money, the more and more I was managing projects and timelines, the more and more I felt way out of depth, right? It was like over my head. So I decided to go back to school, and I got my master's in project management, where they stuffed me full of all kinds of good information about how to do this well. I did keep some of that information. Now I'm trying to deploy it here in my job, and I am still learning. We're all still learning. That's a sign of a good leader and a good project manager. I eventually made the jump to Team Ag Incorporated, which is a private sector ag consulting firm. We do a lot of engineering, planning, design work, agronomy, pretty much a full stop shop for farmers. So that's what I do now. I manage projects. I help my engineering team do their jobs better. What does it mean to endure? I looked at the Watershed forum topics and kind of when I was applying to speak, and I was like, endure was this like very strong meaning, and I just looked it up, and it's one of two things. It's either to remain in existence and last, or to suffer. We all endure a little bit to make these projects endure. And I thought this project was, or this picture was aptly or suited for this kind of definition. We had a buffer planting many years ago, it was 2019, and it was pouring. It was pouring, everything was sopping wet, all the trees were muddy, everything was miserable. We had a low turnout for volunteers. And at the end of the day, me and my counterpart finished the planting by ourselves because everybody left us. And we were muddy, but we endured. We endured because we wanted that project to endure. These are the kinds of things you do so that someday you can have a full buffer, right? You have to take those small steps to make those big things happen, right? So I wanted to start with this because I think when I think of project management, it's not the most sexy topic, right? It's like, okay, spreadsheets and numbers and doing the regular stuff that makes things function. But this is the impact, right? Getting it right with project management means your projects can do more. Your team can do more. You guys can deliver more. So how many folks in the room are project management managers by title? Raise a hand. A few. That's awesome. That's awesome because the people who are managing projects are not always project managers, right? There's all kinds of titles involved. People are engaged at every level of your organization in managing projects. So I'm happy to see that folks who aren't project managers are in the room. And I also wanted to ask, what does project management mean to you? Anybody want to think about it? We'll give you like 30 seconds to think. What does it mean? What comes to mind when you're like, when someone tells you to define project management, what does that mean? Any takers? Any brave people? What do you think, Jim?
I don't know if I'm brave, but I'll at least get the dialogue started.
Yeah.
That's part of my moderating.
Of
job.
course, yeah. Thank you, Jim. We have another one in the back just in case.
Oh, okay.
You know,
good.
sacrifice.
Delivering the project for the dollars, like delivering on the budget, or in budget.
In budget, I love it.
Managing the timeline, tasks, process, evaluation, all parts.
Beautiful. That's excellent.
From a private business side, super stoked clients.
Super stoked clients. That's stoked is not a word that you always hear in that definition. Anybody else? Yeah.
Weaving together all the different people and personalities in your
Oh, yeah.
making
Good.
them all one goal.
Stakeholder management. Yep. Communication.
She's a fun, I was gonna say all the different people involved.
Beautiful. Yep. Teamwork and collaboration. Anybody else?
Can I go now?
Yeah, Jim.
I was just gonna say, you know, having some level of high responsibility that ensure that you're seeing a project through from start to finish.
Responsibility. That's a big one. Yeah, that can be a little stressful, but it's important. Somebody's got to be responsible, right? Those are all excellent responses. So I want to go over the foundations of project management. These are essentially what the school of knowledge, the body of knowledge would tell you are the three legs of the stool, right? You have time, you have scope, and you have cost. And if you remember anything from today, these are like the building blocks of every single project. They must include all these things. Each one of these is a bear in its own right. It's going to have its own set of considerations, which we'll get into. But I just wanted to show you, these are the three things we'll be covering in detail, and then we'll move on to some other things. So scope. What is the overall goal, and how are we going to reach it? It's got to be well-defined. It's got to be discrete with the deliverables you're deciding to deliver, and you've got to break it down into work packages. So if you guys are preparing projects, maybe you're working in a team where you're deciding, hey, we see there's a problem in the world, right? There's not enough trees on the landscape, right? How do you define what you're going to deliver in a grant? How do you define the scope of work that you can then go and build off of, right? You've got to identify your stakeholders, and almost more importantly, you've got to decide what roles and responsibilities all those folks have. Because it's one thing to fill the room with people who are really interested in your work, and it's one thing to talk about this big grand vision you guys have as a group. But if you don't define the roles ahead of time and in the beginning of that process, you are quickly going to start bumping into one another. And when something bad happens, or maybe you get to the next step of a project, everybody goes, not it. I didn't sign up for that. It's not in my contract. I don't know what's going on. So knowing who's doing what and when is very important when you're defining that project in the initiation phase. You guys also, I mean, I'm speaking generally here, right? We have a lot of nonprofits in the room. There's some consultants in the room. There's funders in the room. Some of those stakeholders are going to be your funding organizations like NIFWIF, like USDA, DEP, the State Conservation Commission, whatever it is. Those folks are important stakeholders, right? They're setting the limitations and controls on how you can prepare your projects and what you can deliver with the money they're giving you. Grant recipients, that's a lot of nonprofits in the room, right? You're getting that money. You're going to have say in how you spend it, right? You're going to have a lot of flexibility in how you develop your programs. Technical consultants, at some point, you're going to have to engage. In most cases, you're going to have to engage some technical consultants. Sometimes that's for software. Sometimes that's for planning, design. Those folks are also very important stakeholders in your project. They're going to have some say in, well, this is feasible, this is not feasible, right? And this is what we can do and what we can't do. And they'll let you know that, right? They'll say, hey, you're trying to hire us for A, B, and C, but we can only do A and B. You're going to need another person for C. You got your project owner. A lot of times we are working with third-party people, right? We're saying, hey, we want to do a stormwater project. We're going to have to pull in a municipality as the project owner. Or we're working in somebody's backyard. They're going to be the owner of that thing when we walk away. Or a farmer. We're building manure storage. that farmer has to be bought into the project and own it and maintain it, years down the road. Again, municipal government agencies, these folks are also stakeholders. They're very important to your process. But are you going to have permitting? Are you going to be within their ordinances and their regs? How are you going to handle their constraints on the project? And making sure they're aware of the project, especially if it involves them ahead of time. The third piece here is, how do we recognize and track progress towards our scope of work? So we have a beautiful work breakdown. We've made little work packages. We have all the stakeholders at the table. They all agree on who's doing what, which is phenomenal. And then we say, okay, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. How do we know when you've finished, and how do we know it's done well? So these items, the SMART metrics, how many in the crowd have heard about SMART metrics? Great. Don't have to explain it very much, right? You're setting things like KPIs, key performance indicators, or factors that tell you you're doing good. Preparing your scope is where you're going to decide how you track and how you meet success. Setting good expectations. This is vital. Sometimes we glass right over that. Even personally, sometimes I'm sitting in a room with like-minded individuals and I'll say, I think we're all on the same page. But it's very important, in my opinion, to get those expectations out on paper, recorded, and make sure everybody's comfortable with the expectation that you think is correct, right? By saying, hey, farmer, we're assuming you want to do this, and this way. And the farmer can then comment and say, well, I agree with 2 of those things, but I really need to shift this other one. Setting that expectation prior to people engaging in the work is very important. And then limiting scope creep. I just salted that in there because honestly, if you don't set good expectations and you aren't engaging your stakeholders properly and you don't have well-defined goals and a good work breakdown, it is very easy for your mission and your project to just start creeping. Does everybody know what scope creep is? Got some shaking of heads. Yeah, some nodding, some questionable. So scope creep is really saying, this is the direction we're all heading. We're going to do this objective. Objective covers A, B, and C. And then as you get into the project, people are like, well, this is an easier pathway. And this guy wants to do this. And the farmer asked for this thing. And then the stakeholder said this too. And so all of a sudden where you started with A, B, and C is now X, Y, and Z, right? Because you haven't controlled that process through your scope development. So that's scope. Any questions about scope just before we move on? Yeah.
I guess I just have a question about whether you're defining project management and program management as synonymous, or if you consider those different things.
Yeah, so I should define that. That's a good point. So a well-defined project with discrete deliverables, in my mind, a project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Your project closes out, right? And the same could be said for your program, right? The program has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in that regard, they kind of have the same definition. They might be different scopes, right? The scope of a program might be, we're working with 15 farms, they're all going to have all these types of plans. And a project may be, we're working with 1 farm and he's going to have these BMPs. But in a general sense, you're using the same kind of theory, the mode of action for both of those levels. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Time. So once you have your scope, and this is a lot, and we'll get into this in a second. Maybe I should have made it its own slide, but it's all right now. So once you have a well-defined scope and you say, we're going to do A through Z, these are the people who are going to do it. This is how we're going to go about it, and this is how we're going to track progress. The very next thing you do is start assigning duration to tasks, right? And you're going to start adding dependencies if things are required. You can't do step B until you've done step A. And you're going to start scheduling that out because you guys know, as well as I do, time's really important. In fact, sometimes our grants are so tight, it could be a 3-year window. And you might get a landowner engage in your 3-year window in year 2.5. And now you've got a very tight timeline to turn that farm around, right? Or that landowner, or that project. So scheduling is very important, even if you're not thinking about a project. If you're thinking about a program, scheduling is vital, right? You're saying, okay, for the first 4 weeks, we're going to sit down with all our stakeholders and decide who's doing what. for the next 3 months, we're gonna start sending flyers and we're gonna start door knocking. So I kind of put together a quick Gantt chart. Just how many folks in the room have seen a Gantt chart or used one before? Most of you. Okay, that's helpful. A Gantt chart is just a way to take your schedule and put it on paper in a way that breaks it down into those work packages we've talked about. So this is the most visual way that I thought I could show you guys what a schedule might look like. So you have activity 1, which might be farmer engagement. And you're going to take a few weeks. You're going to take 1 week to do the mailers. You're going to take another week to do ID your parcels and door knock. You're going to take another week to do visits with interested landowners. You're going to sign LOAs in that same amount of time because you're going to be on the farm, right? So that's all happening concurrently. You can do tasks concurrently. You're going to have assigned selected technical service provider in the next week, right? So you're breaking this down into work packages, and then you're assigning amounts of time that you think all of those tasks are going to take. And again, it doesn't have to be this detailed, and you don't have to have dependencies, right? Dependencies are just a way for you to know that something is triggered for the next step to happen, right? If you're thinking in a programmatic sense, you might have tons of concurrent workflows happening all at once. And you could chunk it up into months, right? You could have 3, pieces of the Gantt chart that are very simple, right? But for a project where you're delivering specific items like this, the more detail you have, sometimes the better. So you can tell where your people are and how you're making progress. One important aspect of using Gantt charts is this one's not flexible, right? It's in an Excel format. There are other formats that you could do where it automatically updates as you're going through the work. But let's say you're in week 7, but you're only on activity 1. You now know you've got some catching up to do, right? You're behind schedule and you need to catch up with that. Let's say you're in week 10 and you're crushing it. You're like at the end, you've already bid your project. Super, you're ahead of schedule. So the Gantt chart is just a way to help you manage your timelines. But it was a visual that I thought, when we're talking about scheduling, this is what that means, right? Is blocking out your time. How are you supposed to know how long if you can even do the work in a 3-year period, if you haven't chunked it out and said, this is what we're going to do and when, right? So that's all about time. Any questions about scheduling, dependencies, any of that? Pretty self-explanatory. Very good. All right. Then you've got costs. This is a big one, right? Estimating is the first step of this, right? So you've got your scope, you've got your duration where you think things are going to land. Now you can start assigning costs to the amount of time and the scope that you think you need to deliver. So if you think, hey, this person is going to be working on this piece of your scope for X amount of days or X amount of weeks, and we pay them X amount of dollars per week, you can now start estimating how much money you're going to spend in those weeks, right? So these are items that I think are really important to estimate for. Admin and management, that's a huge chunk of the role you guys are playing as nonprofits. Planning and prelim design, if you're reaching out to a consultant and you need them to do some groundwork, I&E level kind of preliminary design work, that's important for them to provide costs to you. The same for final design, which could include permitting, and it could include reviews and approvals by regulatory agencies. You got to take those costs into account. Procurement costs money. It takes time to do it. It takes experts to run the bids. It takes people involved to get that right. Implementation, obviously, this is a big one. Construction dollars. How much is the actual project going to cost to put on the ground? And then quality assurance, quality control, and closeout. You might have to have folks doing inspections and writing reports and doing red line as-builts to show you what was built and when. So all of those things need to be estimated. Some of those things you're going to be estimating. As the project manager, maybe you're running a program and you've got to figure out how much of your staff time you're going to be using. In other cases, you're going to have to reach out to a technical service provider and have them give you estimates and say, hey, we need a quote for this scope of work. Good thing you have a really good scope of work with work packages broke out. And then financing. This is a piece that some of you might be really involved with and some of you may not be really involved with. In the room, how many folks help manage grants? Lots of you. Got it. Good. So in our world, we have a lot of grant management. We have a lot of grant applications. Obviously, that's a huge piece of our financing, right? Loans can also be used. I work with farmers who want to self-fund and they'll take out financing from an institution to help them pay for the project. They might have cash flow. They might want to match it with some of their own dollars. Tax credits. I don't know how many folks have used REAP, but that's certainly an option for private farmers and operators doing their work. There's always new and interesting markets happening across all the states we have here in the Chesapeake Bay. So nutrient, sediment, ecosystem, carbon credits. How many folks are working on carbon regen kind of projects now? Yeah, a little bit. It's brand spanking new. There's a bunch of new climate smart commodity grants that are out, and it's really driving some of our work as well. That's a big piece. That's a market driven piece. People are buying credits for you to do the project. It is kind of a pay for performance model where you deliver the project and then they pay you based on credits delivered. That's a finance model. That's if it works, it works. It's just another piece of the puzzle. And then the last piece is bidding. I kind of already mentioned this, but for the pieces that you aren't delivering directly, you're requesting quotes. Sometimes you're required to request those quotes, right? You say, well, we got to have a procurement policy. We've got to have at least 3 requests that we get in the door. We have to have an open, maybe sealed bid that we're running. All of those pieces go into your cost scenario. How much is this project going to cost? How are we going to finance it? Those are big questions. And how many folks in the room here have worked through procurement for their own orgs? A couple folks. Are you making your way? Have you been doing it a long time for those folks who raise their hands?
No, like 2 years.
2 years. Okay. You doing like prevailing wage or anything funky or just?
No, we just wrote down the process and followed the process.
Beautiful. That's good project management. Establish the process, do the process, no problems. I like it. So in the project management world, there is this kind of trifecta, and you can find this triangle in a lot of places. And some people put, okay, so you have costs, you have time, and you have the quality of work being delivered for your project. Some people will put in the middle of this triangle impossible, like a little circle that says you can't get all 3 at the same time. But I like to think of this triangle of balance. You're balancing value. I like to think of it as a continuum. Right? Because you're never going to have, what is the perfect cost? What is the perfect timeline? What is the perfect quality? You're always balancing all 3 of those aspects, but it is a good reference to think about as you're bidding projects and as you're preparing to do work. If you've got really good quality and you're doing it very quickly, it's probably going to be very expensive. If you're asking someone to deliver really high quality and you're saying, we can pay you a ton to get really high quality, it might take a while, right? And the same with, I got to do it fast and I got to do it cheap. You may not get a good product. So just remember that as you're bidding projects, as you're interacting as a project manager and you're trying to select and quote projects and find bidders, this is always in the back of my mind, and honestly, some of you won't have the option to select a high quality, high cost, because if you're bidding the project and you've got to go with the lowest responsible bidder, that's what you're going to get, right? But if I know that they're fast and cheap, I'm going to be doing a little bit of extra QA, QC. I'm going to be keeping my eyes on the folks doing that work, because you might lean towards that poor quality spectrum of the triangle. This is not a perfect triangle. Again, it's kind of a continuum. So understanding, pursuing, and delivering value. Value means a lot of things to a lot of people. If I go to a farmer and I say, what is your biggest need for this project? A lot of farmers are going to say, I need this manure storage built tomorrow. Like, I don't care how much it costs. I need it by the winter because my cows are pooping every day and I got to haul every week and I need it done fast. I need it done really fast. And I don't really care that it's the perfect manure storage. It can look a little wonky as long as it passes specs. Sometimes they don't even care about that, but they'll say, I want it fast. So the highest value for that person might be the time, right? We have other folks, maybe the funders, your other stakeholders in the room, the funders that say, oh, whoa, you got to make it cheaper. We cannot pay for $1 million. We can only pay for $500,000. You got to make it cheaper, right? And so in that case, maybe that cost is the highest value. And then you have other folks who are paying for performance, right? And they say, hey, we've got to see bigger bang for our buck. We want to see, really good reductions in your project. And that might be a balance between that quality and the cost, because it's bang per buck, right? So your values may change. And there are values that are outside, obviously. There are values that are outside of those three legs of the stool, right? Someone may say to me, hey, it's really important to me that the color of this barn or this structure matches the color of the rest of my outbuildings. That's important to that farmer, right? Somebody might say, hey, it's really important to me that the entire buffer supports pollinator habitat. I want to see flowering dogwoods. I want to see pretty redbuds. It's got to flower, right? So different people have different values in their projects. We all want successful projects, right? I've never walked onto a site or gathered stakeholders and I said, who wants this to fail? And somebody goes, ooh, me, I'm ready, kill it, you know? Nobody wants it to fail, right? But success might look differently to different people because their values are different. And those values are going to be tied to the objectives of your project. Is your objective water quality? Is it carbon sequestration? Is it animal health and well-being? Is it that you want the barn to be the same color as the other barns? All of these values become objectives that you need to try to meet within your project. Sometimes you're mandated to meet those objectives, right? One very important concept in understanding and delivering value is you can't manage what you don't understand, and you cannot understand what you don't track, right? So if you're in the middle of a project and you say, I have no idea where our budget is. I know we've spent money and I know our folks are out there working and planting trees, but I have no idea where the dollars are. You got to track that. I think that's pretty obvious to you folks. But time is the same, right? The more time you spend on it, the more money you're spending. And oh no, we've only got 3 months left to plant 2 more buffers. Time is important. And so is progress towards your goals. Because again, if you get halfway through the grant and you've spent 50% of your budget, but you've only delivered 25% of your deliverables, now you're in a pickle. So all 3 of these need to be tracked somehow, whether it's Excel sheets or other pieces of software, which is the next piece. Technology can be a really powerful aid if you use it properly. You can go get a Gantt chart. You could whip up a Gantt chart in Excel in pretty quick order. But Excel is not going to track it quickly. It's not going to change as you change in the project. It's all very manual, right? And so there's a bunch of different softwares that can help you do your jobs better. One is a CRM. It's a client relationship management system. That way you can see, hey, I'm working with 100 farmers. All of their projects, all of their information is kept in one single place. If I need to know this guy's phone number and call him up and let him know where his project's at, I go to the CRM. You can have an ERP system, an enterprise resource planning system. Essentially, that's like people are putting time in. It's deducting budget. It's showing you the progress that's been made. There's little tasks that people can check off. And all of a sudden you have like one source of truth where your staff are tracking their time. They're telling you where they are in the project. They're giving you regular milestone updates towards tasks. It could be pretty comprehensive. It can be a beautiful tool. It can take a lot of time to implement in your organization. If you're a small organization that doesn't deal with a lot of clients, it may not be worth investing in a gigantic tool, right? Salesforce is one of those gigantic CRMs. A small 10-person nonprofit who's just running along with grants may not need, Salesforce. You might want something smaller where your folks can track their time and check off tasks, but be careful about trying to eat the whole elephant as your company is growing. And then time and progress tracking softwares. There are probably hundreds, dozens at least, of different softwares that you can try to use to help your team manage their time, to give you progress updates, to tell you where your budget's at. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are already using really good tools for your budgets, at least for QuickBooks and other things that you're tracking your budgets through. So there's a lot of ways. There's a lot of tools out there for you to use to help you do your jobs a little better and keep eyes on these 3 very important items. So we're going to go into an example project. So there's a farmer. Farmer Jane Doe operates a 60-cow dairy, southeast Pennsylvania, around 80 acres of, that's supposed to say crop, hay, and pasture land. The problem, the farmer has got an open mortality compost area, which allows runoff to run down an access lane directly into a creek. Not so good. They also have a watering system that pumps water from the stream into a trough, but it's really unreliable because they've got like a car battery that's under that blue bucket, and it's not ideal, right? So the project scope is building a roofed compost stacking structure where bed pack and mortalities can be kept and composted. And we're going to build her a gravity-fed watering system down to a trough so she doesn't have to pump water from the river, and it's going to be protected for her animals. So what risks in this project, as you're thinking about this project as a project manager or somebody who's trying to manage the process, what risks do you guys see? And I'll go back to the scenario. Yeah.
Environmental risk, you're gonna be digging up an area to try to build this system when we don't really know much about what you're digging up or getting into.
Very true. Yeah, that's a big one. Yep. Got to call 811 before you dig, right? At least in Pennsylvania. That has somebody come out, check your utilities for sure. Got to have an E&S plan, erosion sedimentation plan, make sure that all that sediment's being captured while we're doing construction. Very good. Anybody else? Yeah. Drought on the,
If you're pulling water from the stream in order to make this project ultimately successful and water levels will drop.
right? That's the problem they're having. We're installing a gravity fed system from a well at the headquarters.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry, I should have wrote that down in there.
okay.
Yeah.
So it's from the stream.
Yeah, that's a very good risk. I mean, as far as, yeah, if we continue to do on-stream watering. Yep. Anybody else?
I don't know, but not like scope creep, like when you're on property being big, and then there's this other thing, it's staying in line with what, this is what we're here to do.
Oh,
not
yeah.
The 50 other things on your property.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, could you just expand this access
Right.
gravel a little bit? And then all of a sudden you're over stormwater permit? Big deal. Mm-hmm.
Halfway through the project, she decides to sell the farm.
Oh, and it has happened. Big risk. That's a big risk. Yeah.
Financing the project?
Yeah, you run out of money. Oh my God, the contractor spent twice as much. What are we gonna do? Any others? These are all really good risks. Well, they're bad risks, but good on calling them out. Yeah. One risk. Oops. We had a design spec for concrete that was 4,000 PSI, pounds per square inch. And the brake test, the columns, this guy's pulling brake. I just want an example. These aren't my photos. This one isn't. Of this guy pulling columns of concrete, and then you go test the pressure of that concrete. It did not meet the spec, right, that we had in our design, right? So now what? We went back to the structural engineer first, and we said, hey, boss, like, is this thing gonna collapse? Because it's a structure, it's a roof structure, remember? And the roof structure is sitting on top of concrete walls and a concrete floor. And he goes back into stat and he does a little bit of calculating, and he finds out, hey, it's not ideal, but it's safe. You know, this thing is not going to fall over on anybody, right? And then I say, hey, engineer, it's not going to fall over, but what's the issue here? I mean, you had a spec we needed to meet. And the engineer goes, well, he didn't meet the thing we told him to meet, right? So that's a problem in its own right, you know, holding a contractor accountable, right? But also the durability of this structure is going to go down, right? And as all of us here know, we're putting these practices into models that expect a certain lifetime, right? So we're saying this structure is going to last 15 years. And we're putting a PE seal on it that says that. And then we're putting it into a model that trusts that that structure is going to last about 15 years. And now we've got a durability issue, right? We're like, how do we fix that? There's a couple of options. One, we can go in and do an invasive test and pull another core concrete out of the wall and see if it meets the spec, right? That's invasive, costs some money. Then you got to repair the hole that you've made in the wall. It's not ideal. The second one is we say, rip it all out, re-pour the thing, put the structure back up. We're angry that you took too long getting us the brake test and you went and built the rest anyway. That's an option. We could say, hey, we're going to do extra backfill and we're going to pour another level of concrete just to make sure it's reinforced. It's kind of expensive, not ideal. The farmers, you know, they're invading their space now. Or we can do some sealant on the outside of the concrete just to improve the durability so that when they're in there working it, they're not going to ding the concrete or damage the concrete as often as they would otherwise. So as a project manager, I have this suite of options. They all sound in varying degrees good, bad, and ugly, but I am not responsible for making that sole decision. And neither are you guys. As project managers, you are not the sole provider of decisions. So what do? You go to your stakeholders and you allow them to make informed decisions. And you go to them, you say, hey, here's the scenario. We know there's limited amounts of funding. We understand the situation is not ideal. We understand it's going to take this amount of time to correct the situation. Which one of these options is the best in your perspective? And we did that. We sat down with our stakeholders and they said, well, the least invasive, the least cost, and the fastest we could do would be to apply that sealant to the outside of the concrete. It would still delay the project, and they allowed us to delay for another 2 months for the contractor to get his ducks in a row. But again, the important lesson here is I'm not making that call. The stakeholders are making that call. They're paying for it. They're driving the deliverable and the objectives. And then you create a plan of action. We said, okay, thank you, stakeholders. We will call a contractor. We're going to get that, those specs over to the contractor so he can order the supplies and make sure that he applies it the right way. He's going to have to scrub the whole thing. So what happened is they had already filled it with manure and, mortality. They had to clean it off. They power washed all the walls. And this was kind of an effort in accountability as well. We said, hey, contractor, we're not going to make you rip it out, but you're sure as shit going to come back and fix it. All right? Because we're not going to let that fly, right? You've got to meet the specs we're giving you. So he went out and he power washed everything. And then he got the sealant and he applied everything. It looks beautiful. The farmer's happy with it. She's using it now. That's a good outcome, right? But there are different types of risk, right? And as a project manager, you can't run around with your hair on fire all the time thinking about every risk the same, right? Concrete not meeting its spec on a liquid storage is a whole lot more concerning than concrete not meeting its spec, in this case, on a small, essentially a shed, right? A compost shed. It's definitely different than a roof truss not meeting its spec, right? So there's different levels of risk here. And I put these two because I know people think differently about images. So I just wanted to give you two opportunities to think about risk and impact. You have risks that are really low probability that are also low impact. And you have risks that are really low priority that may be high impact, actually, in some cases. You might have a really high probability and a high impact. That's a dangerous situation. As a project manager, I'm going to raise a lot of red flags if I see, hey, there's something that's very likely to happen. And if it would happen, it would really make this project awful, right? That's like your number one thing as a project manager. Those are the circumstances that you want to manage the most, right? For instance, a farmer selling their farm and getting out of dairy in the middle of a project, that's a humongous impact. So how do I manage that ahead of time? I sit down with the farmer ahead of time and I say, hey, how are things feeling for the farm? How are we feeling? Are we going to be in dairy in a few years? Are you pretty confident that you've got some succession here with your kids? How are you feeling like financially? I don't need to see your tax records. I just want to know that you have some confidence in this. And if the farmer goes, boy, no, I don't actually. I think I'm going to sell like next year. Okay, stakeholders need to know that, right? Again, I'm not going to pull the plug on that project. I'm going to go back to the stakeholders and I'm going to say, hey, stakeholders, me as the project manager, just giving you some flags to make you aware that there may be issues. There's some risks that we might want to manage. And if that risk is too high and too likely, you may have to stop that project, right? Or if I go to this person and I say, hey, are you going to sell a farm? And they say, absolutely not. There's no way. It's a very high impact, but it's a low probability. We can probably carry on. So those are the kinds of things. Or another thing that happened on that project, and this is a risk, that the contractor could come in and break a piece of the property while they're there. He came in with his pump truck and he crushed like 20 feet of gutters on their barn. That is maybe a moderate probability. Stuff happens, you know, manure happens. It's okay. Is it a huge impact? No, it's probably moderate, as long as the contractor's aware that they're responsible for that endeavor. Any questions about risk? We'll talk about managing it in a minute. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe it's part of what we'll get to, but what are your tips and tricks for saying no when you get into a spot where you're like, the risk is too high, no?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky that I'm a technical service provider and I can go to the stakeholder and say, this ain't gonna work. And the stakeholder goes, no, carry on. I can say, we can't accept that risk, right? Because Team Ag does not want to be involved in a project where we do half the work and then the farm sells. We don't want to be involved. But you as a stakeholder or you as a grant manager may not be able to say no, right? You say like, the farmer signed the LOA, they're moving forward, we already paid for this work, you know, half the work is already done, you know, we need to see some deliverable out of this, right? You may have to press forward. In that case, you're gonna have to think very hard with your stakeholder team, sit down with the project owner and say, yes, but, right? Yes, we can do this thing for you that's maybe a little out of scope, or yes, we can deal with this risk, but it's gonna cost a lot more money. We're gonna have to make some contingency plans. Like, let's say the farmer's selling the farm. Do they know who they're selling it to? Can we pause the project until such a time where there's a new owner and we can discuss the project with that new owner? There's a lot of risk involved in that, but you have to think creatively on the next step, which next slide we'll talk about it. That's a good question though. So how can we manage these risks? I heard this once, there are no dry seats on the Titanic. Sometimes you can't avoid catastrophe, right? But nobody wins if nobody plans properly ahead of time. The contractor doesn't win, the project owner doesn't win, the funder doesn't win. We're all on the Titanic. It's not a very fun time, right? So sometimes it's unavoidable, but you can manage that risk if you think ahead. Some ways to do that: contract development and review is vital. You guys as nonprofits are going, especially as grant managers, are going to be reviewing contracts and you're going to be developing your contracts. Make sure that you've got contingency plans built into your contract. Sometimes that comes across as, hey, we have to have your certificate of insurance. We want to be listed on your certificate of insurance. Sometimes your contract needs to involve even bigger contingencies like insurance and bonding, right? You might say, hey, your insurance is great for the gutter that got crushed, but it's pretty awful when it comes to replacing the manure storage that you poured wrong. So we're actually going to have a performance bond, right? So that if you don't do it right, or one of your subs doesn't do it right, that somebody is going to pay us back and make sure it's done properly. So that contingency planning is very important inside your contract, and you folks need to review those contracts for that kind of language too. Always expectation setting and good communication. If that contractor had told us at the 7-day break that the PSI was way too low for the expected period of time, we would have told him, and we would have told the farmer, do not build the structure. Just wait for this concrete, wait for the 56-day break, which is a long time to wait, I get it, but wait until then to see if it comes out. Because if you build the structure on top, you run out of options, right? And now if you're ripping it out, you're ripping out all the concrete, you're ripping out all the timber. It's a much worse situation. So good communication, frequent communication with your contractors, with your consultants, making sure everybody's always on the same page, that you're getting the information you need in a timely manner. That's vital for avoiding risk and making sure you're making good progress. Yeah, again, contingency planning, that could be built into a contract. It could be built into your bid documents as well. If you're creating a bid package and you want them to include bonding inside of their bid, you better list that in your invitation to bid, because they're not going to know unless you tell them ahead of time. And they've got to account for those costs as contractors. Experience planning. I added risk register here, and Ben Franklin's very good quote at the bottom: an ounce of planning is worth a pound of prevention. No, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound
Pure.
of cure. See, you got me
I
messed
know,
up.
It was either one or the other.
Yeah. I was just guessing at the end. No, but it's very important. So if you have had experience managing projects or you're working with very experienced project managers, lean on them for their experience. Create a risk register where every time you do a project, when you finish, you meet as a team and you do a debrief and you say, wow, we ran into this issue, we ran into that issue, we resolved it in this way, and we couldn't resolve the other one. And you compile that information into a register that you reference as you're developing your future projects. And that'll give you some experience as you go, that you're learning lessons from these hard projects, right? Don't walk away from that project going, well, that was totally muffed and there's no way we can avoid it. You know, that's no good. That's not going to help you in the long term. Take that lesson and record it with your staff. Don't just hold on to that yourself. You know, that needs to be shared with the people you work with and your organization, either in a risk register or at least in conversation so that folks can think ahead and benefit from a bad moment. Like that's the silver lining of running into issues. So I wanted to give us a watershed view because I realized you all devoted some time to a seminar called Project Management during a watershed forum. So I really appreciate it. And I wanted to give you a watershed view. And if you could just move that so I can maybe make sure that I get all the things. So you've got your project initiation and you've got your input as precipitation. You've got your financial planning, you've got your scheduling.
Also make it small if you press on the little like.
Oh,
just that
beautiful.
one over there.
Yeah, there you go. Excellent. Well done. And so you've got all these inputs, right? And you've got these risks happening in all of those inputs, right? And it's going onto the landscape and it's collecting and you're managing your resources. You're managing and allocating your resources, which includes your time and your staff and your money, right? It's all coming together in a project. And you've got these external constraints that says your stakeholder says, you can't build that barn, you can only build the barnyard, right? Or you have internal constraints that say, we don't really provide that service. So that's something we can't include in the project, right? You've got your lessons learned over here in the groundwater. You've got collaboration, infiltrating into your aquifer and your teamwork, all these things coming together. And then you have your project success, which is the bay, right? So that's really what it's all about. So I did this extra special for all of you as well. So when you're thinking about the bay and you're thinking about all these inputs and these constraints and controls on projects and scopes and budgets and time, I want you to kind of take these key points away with this process here. Project management can make or break your mission. It can make or break your project. You can't ignore this stuff, right? It can also impact you whether you're, you know, the organizational leader, the executive director, or just somebody planting trees, right? And not just somebody. People planting trees are very important, right? But you should be thinking about management too. It's as simple as saying, do I run one single tree a mile down the stream and plug it in, and then all the way back to that tractor and grab another tree and run it the whole? No, you're going to ask for the tractor to be moved closer, and you're going to move them at a flat at a time, right? That's management, really, in its simplest form. So project management is very important. That's the key I want to get away. When things are chaotic, remember those foundations, right? It can be a lot to manage a project successfully. There's a lot of people involved in the projects you're running or trying to get off the ground. But if you can break it into work packages that say, let's focus. What's the scope? What's the budget? How much time do we think it's going to take? Take it piece by piece. Don't swallow the elephant all at once. You will run into issues. Manure happens, right? But you can learn from them, prepare for the next time, and handle them as best you can with the information you have. The more information you can gather and keep and track, and the more accurate that information is, the better you are going to be situated to react to issues and to deal with them appropriately, and also to plan ahead, right? Make some contingency plans so that you don't hit that pothole in the road. And one last thing, good project managers continue to grow and adapt forever. Like, you're never gonna stop learning, and you're never gonna stop learning new things about new topics. You're never gonna stop meeting new people and networking. Every project you're gonna work on is gonna be different, right? No single project is ever gonna be the same as the last one. So you're gonna have to continue learning and be open to that, right? Don't look at the risks you're running into or the issues you ran into a project as the end all and say, well, I'm throwing my hands in the air. I don't know how to do this. Just keep learning, just keep working at it. You know, lean on experienced people in the room. There's a lot of really good experience in the environmental field. Certainly you can reach out to me if you have issues that you want to just talk through and brainstorm. I'm always happy to talk about stuff like this, but you know, don't underestimate how much folks have experienced. Try to learn from those folks around you. And last, have a little fun, because like project management can be grueling, right? There's a lot of responsibility involved. There's a lot of pressure and weight on your shoulders. You're like, I'm managing $1 million grant and I have no idea what I'm doing. Don't panic. Break it into work packages, deal with it piece by piece at a time, lean on the folks around you to help you manage. Don't panic. Just have a little fun. You'll be all right. So any questions about project management?
Perfect timing. I didn't even get the whole 5 minutes remaining. So.
Yeah.
Questions for Sarah?
Yeah.
Going back to risks and decision-making,
Mhm.
are there good examples? So I imagine there's some examples of where people are looking to you to be the leader
Mhm.
of a project and you to make a decision.
Right.
So, you know, is there a balance of trying to lean on your stakeholders to try to
Mhm.
help you make a decision, or have you had examples where they're like, you figure it out,
Yeah.
you know, you're the leader of this project,
Oh yeah.
make the call?
Yeah. So I have had folks lean on me and say like, you're where the buck stops. You tell me how you want to handle it. My response to that is usually, well, let's have a discussion about what options are on the table, especially if it's an issue, right? Let's say we've got 3 options. I'm going to run through that with all the stakeholders. And I'm lucky that I have technical service folks on my team, right? I've got PE engineers, I've got, you know, certified planners. If someone's asking me to make a decision that is out of my wheelhouse, like it's out of my expertise, I shouldn't be making that decision. Certainly not alone, right? And so I'm always deferring to my team, you know, hey, I've got an answer or a question from this contractor. Here are the options he's thinking, but I need your information, right? And then the PE will give me his information. And maybe I talk to the planner too, and the planner gives me a new set of information. And with all that information, I go to the stakeholders and I say, all right, given that the project owner wants this, the PE says these 2 things are feasible, and the planner says this is the regulation, my guidance to you would be to take this course of action. I would love to discuss other options if you have them. And then it's a dialogue. And then at the end of that conversation, you have to set the expectations, right? Like, okay, I'm going to move forward with this plan of action. Is everybody in agreement on that plan of action? That's usually how it goes. There have only been a few scenarios where people are like, well, Sarah's the only one who can make an assessment on that. I don't know enough to be the sole proprietor of decision-making. You know, in some cases you do have to lead, but that doesn't mean you're making the sole decision. So, yeah.
Well, I did want to comment as a federal grant maker that when we get reports, the reports we ask for are budget, timeline, and scope. So this process also helps if and we don't grade on the success, we grade on the ability to tell us why or why not it was successful. So all these things play into it. But one of the things we are seeing is folks that write in proposals aren't scoping out the expenses to the level they need to. And an example is we get projects that will go through merit review that have significant construction and they didn't put any budget for the NEPA analysis, the environmental impact statement. And we have to go back to them and say, you already got the grant, either accept it and find the money elsewhere, or you withdraw.
Yeah.
Because if those costs aren't in the grant award, they got to come up with it on their own. So do you get involved in helping project folks scope out that level of detail? And should they be seeking out potential?
So two answers to that. One is TMAG does a lot of kind of extracurricular help with the financing. So we might have, Allison's laughing because we do a lot of this with the Clean Water Partners, but you might have a farm come to you and say, hey, I need to fund this big honking project. And we know we're going to do some estimating ahead of time. We're like, that's $500,000. Does the farmer, have cost share for $500,000 project if it goes over by some amount? And the answer is usually no, right? So then us as Team Ag says, well, we want the project to move forward. We have a good relationship with the farmer. It's an awesome project. Let's go help out where we can. We might write a second grant or a third grant, or we might go to one of the partners in the room and say, hey, Stroud, I got this guy. He lives on this road. He's putting in a buffer. Do you think you could throw a little cash at the construction? And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, right? And then sometimes you've got to go back to the farmer and say, hey, man, here's your cost share, right? Can you swallow that? Or do we need to go hustle up and delay the project by some amount of time until we figure it out? And that can be a huge challenge. But to avoid that challenge, fantastic question on the front end. If you're working with technical experts, like if you're putting together a budget and a big portion of that budget is like totally out of your expertise, and this kind of comes back to your question too, lean on the technical expert. Call them up and say, hey, we're doing this project. Here's kind of the very rough scope of work. Ballpark it. Like, are we talking 20,000? Are we talking 200,000? Are we talking 2,000? And get that consultant to give you like a, hey, it's a minor stormwater permit, 3,000. Hey, it's a major stormwater permit, 20,000. Hey, it's a NEPA, good luck. No, I'm kidding. But sometimes, I mean, be prepared for that answer though. Sometimes they're like, hey man, I don't have time to go chase down all those, details. And you got to find another technical expert to help you make that estimate. So yeah, two questions. Sometimes you help find the extra money and sometimes you got to plan ahead to make sure you write it in there in the first place.
So, you sort of a little bit touched on this, but it's a land of say no. Like this is like a real situation, but it's also potentially broader. Is that we have been working with somebody and the like point of contact changed and how like what they wanted to do, their willingness to do the grant, their willingness to like they were like, no, we don't want to do this thing, we don't want to do this, but we already have the money, and they were like in this land of like now, and it's like we've already like restructured it once. It's like restructuring it a second time would be like, it's just we don't have the resources like from a people side to like do this like and it's like hard to know whether or not like, yeah, can we go to the stakeholder and be like, we can't do this anymore?
Yeah.
Or like at what, like how do you get to that no sometimes of the risk or like the scope, that scope.
How to get to know. Not like this whole crew. We're just gonna say no to a lot of stuff. It's gonna be fine.
I feel like it's easier to like know the projects you're excited about and
Yeah, it can be hard to say no, right? Especially if you've done all the prelim planning and the permits are like in the works and the farmer's like, I gotta pull the plug on this thing. It's hard to do. There are scenarios. I was working on a project where the farmer, we were preparing a comprehensive nutrient management plan for this farmer and we completed it. That's a huge package of work. We spent a lot of money getting it done and wrapped up, bow tie, and submitted it, for funding. And then the farmer said, hey, I don't want to do this project anymore, right? But then the nonprofit came in and they said, hey man, we paid them to do that work. And if you're not moving forward with the rest, you've got to pay them to do that work, right? And the work was already done. And so the farmer was like, ooh, I don't have that money. And we were like, well, you can either finance it, which is uncomfortable. That's an awful conversation with a farmer. Or you can move forward with the project. And if there's a specific piece of the project that's making you the most nervous, let's discuss a change. And at the end of the day, the farmer was like, well, yeah, I was most nervous about this thing. We're like, why didn't you just say that instead of, pulling the plug on the whole project? But again, communication, very good communication is important. And so having that discussion with the farmer, we made a pathway forward. I'm not going to say that's going to work every time. If the farmer was like, nope, I'm not bending at all, go pound sand. At that point, you've got to go find another way to deliver what you've promised to deliver. That sucks, but it's the reality. We've all been there, right? Where projects didn't work the way you thought they would, and you got to go find a replacement. That's not fun.
I think it also depends on like the contracts, right?
Yeah.
You are legally bound to do something and they legally agree to do something. And it's like,
oh yeah.
That's not like I can just walk away from this.
Yeah, that's also very true. That farmer had signed an agreement to get the CNP and move forward with the project.
Right.
I will say that very few nonprofits would have the appetite to hold the farmer legally accountable,
Right.
Or funders.
or funders. Nobody wants to sue a farmer over a tricky project. So while I really do appreciate having the language in there, because that's a point of discussion, right, with the farmer or any landowner or any stakeholder, is like, hey, we all agreed to this, you signed it. We all reviewed it, you got to read it, you know, we gave you a month to read it and review it. We agreed to it ahead of time. We went and sought funding for that project. We acquired the funding. It's been 2 years in the making and you agreed to it. We need you to hold, you know, yourself accountable here. And sometimes that's enough. It helps to have that foundation of the contract, but it's not always a perfect, you know, solution.
Yeah, not always appropriate, but depending on the scale.
Yeah.
Of the project, the amount of money.
Oh, yeah.
That's concerning
Mm-hmm.
might have to go there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Again, uncomfortable conversations. So.
Well, I hate to quit the good discussion here, but it's a little after 4, we're all out of time, so, but you have, Sarah's gonna be here.
Yeah,
You
I'll
have
be
her
around.
contact info, as you can see, wealth of information, great resource.
I was just gonna say, there were